Odd punishments in 18th century Japan that involved umbrellas. Imagine yourself walking through the narrow streets of Edo, which you know today as Tokyo, sometime in the middle of the 18th century. The year could be 1745, or perhaps 1762. The exact date does not matter, because what mattered then was not the march of centuries, but the immediate rhythm of seasons, the cycle of rice planting, and the endlessly repeating festivals. This was a city alive with wooden houses, narrow alleys, crowded marketplaces, and strict rules that governed almost every part of daily life. You live in a society bound by the Tokugawa shogunate, a system that prized order above all. The shogun, officially the military ruler, stood at the top, though he rarely interfered in petty matters of daily crime. That responsibility fell to local magistrates, police officials known as yuriki and dashin, and even neighborhood heads who were tasked with reporting bad behavior. Every small detail of society was controlled. People were not free to dress however they wished, nor could they live outside the confines of their registered neighborhoods. Even entertainment, such as the kabuki theater, was tightly monitored. Within this rigid world, punishment was not simply a matter of throwing someone into prison. In fact, prisons were rare, and the idea of locking someone away for long periods was considered wasteful. Instead, punishments were quick, often public, and designed to bring shame or correction. For minor crimes, such as petty theft, drunken brawling, or breaking curfew, these punishments could involve objects as mundane as an umbrella. You may be surprised to learn that umbrellas in 18th century Japan were not cheap, disposable items like the ones you see today. They were carefully made from bamboo and oiled paper, often painted and decorated. To break one was a small misfortune. To misuse one could, oddly enough, become part of a judicial sentence. Historical records from the Edo magistrates' offices mention punishments where an umbrella was strapped to the back of a petty thief, who was then paraded through the streets while neighbors jeered. The idea was not physical pain but humiliation. In this society, shame was a tool as sharp as any sword. The Japanese term haji carried a weight that could ruin reputations, family honor, and even business prospects. When someone was punished with an umbrella tied above their head, it was a way of marking them as foolish or untrustworthy. It turned the ordinary act of carrying an umbrella into a sign of disgrace. But why umbrellas? Part of the reason lies in symbolism. Umbrellas were associated with protection and refinement. To turn that into ridicule was to invert its meaning. The condemned person looked ridiculous, stumbling along with the oversized object strapped in place, unable to remove it until the magistrate's men allowed. This absurd sight turned the criminal into a walking joke, and laughter was often a sharper sting than a fine or a slap. Life in Edo was crowded. Wooden houses leaned close together, fire hazards loomed everywhere, and neighbors knew each other's business. When someone was punished in public, everyone saw it. Imagine yourself in a marketplace where fishmongers shouted prices and women bargained for rice. Suddenly a small procession arrives. A minor criminal led by two dashin, their long spears tapping the ground, while the accused staggers under the awkward weight of an umbrella strapped across his back. Children laugh, adults point, and gossip spreads faster than the smell of grilled eel on the summer air. That moment of humiliation might last only a short walk, but the shame would linger for months. The umbrella punishment was only one example of the shogunate's obsession with visible correction. For more serious crimes, punishments could be far harsher, from flogging to banishment. Yet for the petty misdeeds that constantly troubled city officials, gambling, drunkenness, quarrels, the need was for something that corrected without overburdening the system. A man fined too heavily might become a beggar. A man beaten too brutally might not recover to work and pay taxes. But a man mocked in public would think twice before repeating his mistake, or so the logic went. What makes this boring, yet fascinating, is the level of detail the shogunate kept about even these minor events. Magistrates' diaries include notes about punishments, the names of offenders, and the reactions of the crowd. Some cases mention umbrella punishments specifically for women accused of gossiping too much, or for shopkeepers who sold watered-down sake. Imagine the embarrassment of a respected shop owner forced to walk through his own district, umbrella strapped above his head, while his customers laughed at him. These punishments also remind you that Edo society was built not only on laws but on appearances. Order was maintained by making disobedience look ridiculous. The umbrella was not a weapon, nor a heavy burden. It was simply an object made absurd, turning its bearer into a symbol of foolishness. To understand why this mattered, you must look deeper into the structure of Tokugawa Japan. Society was divided into rigid classes: samurai at the top, then peasants, artisans, and merchants. Each class had strict roles. A samurai who committed a crime might be forced to perform ritual suicide, known as seppuku, while a merchant might face public humiliation instead. In this way, punishments reinforced hierarchy as much as they punished crime. Umbrella punishments were rarely recorded for samurai. They were considered beneath the dignity of a warrior. But for commoners, the sight of a humiliated man or woman stumbling through the market was a warning. You could laugh, but you also remembered, break the rules and you might be next. The boring detail of umbrellas tells you much about Edo life. Objects that today you barely notice carried deep social meaning. An umbrella was not just for rain, but for ritual, status, and even humiliation. Public punishment was as much theater as it was law, and every onlooker, even the smallest child, played a role in sustaining the order of society by participating in the laughter. Yet one question remains. If an umbrella could humiliate a criminal in the streets of Edo, what does that tell you about a society where laughter was as sharp as any sword and shame more powerful than iron bars? You now know that the umbrella was more than a shield against rain in 18th century Japan. It was a symbol, sometimes refined, sometimes ridiculous, and occasionally a tool for punishment. To understand why this worked, you need to step more deeply into the world of Tokugawa justice, where punishments were shaped less by prisons and more by the theater of public shame. Edo justice rested on the principle of deterrence through visibility. You lived in a society without long-term incarceration as the primary tool. Instead, most punishments fell into categories: fines, exile, physical pain, or humiliation. Among these, humiliation was by far the cheapest and most effective for petty crimes. It required no building, no guards, and no extended effort. All it needed was a symbol, a crowd, and the willingness of officials to enforce it. The role of shame. To you today, shame may feel personal, internal, and private. In Edo, Japan, shame was public currency. A merchant could lose customers if his honor was damaged. A craftsman could lose apprentices if his reliability was questioned. Even a farmer could lose standing in the village if his reputation soured. Shame was collective, and punishment through mockery attacked that foundation directly. The umbrella punishment worked because it twisted a familiar object into a sign of disgrace. Imagine a world where an umbrella was not mass-produced in factories but handmade, with ribs of bamboo, paper carefully oiled with persimmon juice, and joints tied with silk thread. Owning one meant you had a measure of refinement. To turn it into a prop of ridicule stripped the object of dignity and, by extension, stripped dignity from its wearer. Records from magistrates in Edo and Osaka mention other shaming devices: wooden placards tied around the neck announcing crimes, straw mats worn as cloaks, and in some cases, painted faces to mark the guilty. The umbrella fit within this broader culture of turning ordinary objects into signals of disgrace. It worked precisely because it was absurd. Who received the umbrella punishment? Not everyone. The punishment was reserved for commoners, particularly those accused of petty theft, gossip, public disturbance, or selling bad goods. Women accused of slander were sometimes paraded with umbrellas tied to their backs, their heads bowed low as they walked through markets. Men who had cheated in gambling or tried to trick customers might be made to carry the ridiculous contraption. One case recorded in 1768 in Edo describes a shopkeeper who mixed too much water into sake. His customers complained. When officials investigated, he admitted guilt. His punishment: to walk through Nyanbashi district with an umbrella tied to his shoulders while a placard announced his crime. Witnesses noted that neighbors laughed loudly, and the punishment was considered successful in deterring other vendors. For women, the punishment was often linked to gossip or quarreling. The Machibujiosho, the city magistrates, believed that quarrels among women threatened neighborhood harmony. Strapping an umbrella to a woman's back while she was marched around her own block was enough to make others reconsider loud disputes. It was a punishment targeted at the lowest level of crime, and yet it carried real consequences. For months afterward, the punished person might be whispered about as the one with the umbrella. Daily theater of punishment. What makes Edo justice different from modern systems is how public it was. The umbrella punishment was not hidden inside walls. It was a street event. When someone was paraded, officials made sure the route passed through busy marketplaces, rice exchanges, or temple fairs where people gathered. You could not avoid seeing it. For the crowd, it was entertainment and warning in equal measure. Punishment blurred into performance. Some laughed. Others pointed. Children whispered to their parents. And everyone, in seeing the ridiculous sight, reinforced the authority of the magistrate who had ordered it. In a way, Edo punishments were miniature plays. There was always a stage, the street. There were props, umbrellas, placards, ropes. There were actors, the guilty, the guards, the jeering crowd. And there was a moral at the end. Do not repeat this behavior. The difference was that the actors had no choice in their role. A world without prisons. To understand why the umbrella mattered, consider the absence of long-term prisons. The Tokugawa shogunate avoided the expense of holding people for years. Punishments had to be immediate. For severe crimes, execution or exile solved the problem. For petty crimes, shame was the middle ground. This saved resources. It also reflected Confucian ideals of order, where the community corrected itself through visibility. A punished man returned home to his neighbors, who would remind him of his disgrace. A punished woman returned to her market, where gossip kept the memory alive. No jail cell was needed. The umbrella did the work of months of confinement in just a short walk. Comparisons with other cultures. If you look across history, you see similar devices. In medieval Europe, a scold's bridle was placed on gossiping women. In colonial America, people were made to stand in the stocks. In China, criminals carried heavy cangs, wooden frames around their necks. The Japanese umbrella punishment was a gentler cousin of these methods, designed more for ridicule than pain. What makes it unique is its almost playful absurdity. A scold's bridle inflicted discomfort. Stocks left scars. But an umbrella, tied awkwardly across the back, was simply humiliating. It reduced a person to a walking joke, which in a culture so deeply concerned with reputation, was painful enough. Continuity and control. Punishments like these also maintained control without violence. The shogunate preferred stability. Too much bloodshed risked uprisings. Too little discipline risked disorder. A balance was needed. The umbrella punishment struck that balance. It was cheap, effective, and avoided unnecessary cruelty, while still keeping petty crime visible. But one question lingers. If shame was so powerful in Edo Japan, and umbrellas could ruin a reputation, how did those punished live afterward? Could they recover from such disgrace? Or were they marked forever as the one who walked with the umbrella? You now know how umbrellas were used as tools of humiliation in Edo, Japan, and how the shogunate saw shame as an efficient way to enforce order. But what happened after the punishment? Did the person simply return to normal life, or did the umbrella mark them forever? To answer this, you need to look at how reputation worked in the tight social fabric of 18th century Japanese towns and villages. Returning to the neighborhood. Edo was not a vast anonymous city like modern Tokyo. It was large for its time, with perhaps 1 million residents at its peak, but it was divided into small, tightly knit neighborhoods called cho. Each cho had its own headman, its own patrols, and its own gossip networks. Everyone knew each other. If you were punished with the umbrella, your neighbors saw it. Your employer probably heard about it. Your children, if you had them, carried the weight of your disgrace to school. This meant the punishment followed you long after the umbrella was removed. Shopkeepers might avoid giving you credit. Customers might choose another vendor. If you were a craftsman, people might hesitate to hire you. A punishment meant for quick humiliation could cast a long shadow over your livelihood. Yet recovery was possible. Edo society was not built on permanent exile for petty crimes. A punished person could slowly regain standing by showing good behavior, making offerings at temples, or demonstrating responsibility in the community. Some records suggest that after a year or two, the memory of a punishment faded, replaced by newer gossip. In this sense, the umbrella was both harsh and forgiving. It marked you in the moment but did not destroy your future completely. The role of group responsibility. Another layer that shaped the impact of punishment was group accountability. In Tokugawa, Japan, people were often organized into groups of 5 households, known as ganengumi. These groups were responsible for reporting crimes and ensuring good behavior among their members. If one person was punished, the entire group felt the effects. Imagine being punished with the umbrella and then returning home. Your 4 household neighbors would likely scold you, not only for your own disgrace but for the shame you brought upon them. This pressure reinforced discipline beyond the punishment itself. It meant that even after the public walk ended, the punishment continued in whispers, warnings, and watchful eyes. Umbrella punishments in popular imagination. Interestingly, some evidence suggests that umbrella punishments became almost comic references in popular culture. Satirical woodblock prints occasionally mocked people with exaggerated umbrellas strapped to their backs, and plays in small theaters sometimes made jokes about walking with the umbrella. This shows that the punishment was not only a legal measure but also a cultural image, a shorthand for foolishness. Just as a dunce cap in European classrooms came to symbolize stupidity, the umbrella became a symbol of public embarrassment in Edo, Japan. Yet satire could cut both ways. On one hand, it amplified the humiliation, ensuring everyone remembered the association. On the other, it softened the punishment by turning it into a common cultural joke, lessening its sting over time. Decline of the punishment. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, some punishments like the umbrella began to fade. As the shogunate faced more serious political challenges, economic struggles, Western contact, and internal unrest, the focus shifted to larger issues of control. Humiliating punishments still existed, but they were less emphasized in official records. More attention went to financial penalties, exile, or labor sentences. Part of this decline may have been due to changing ideas of justice. Intellectuals influenced by Neo-Confucianism debated the role of mercy and correction versus ridicule. Some argued that excessive humiliation damaged society by fostering resentment rather than reform. Others felt it remained effective for minor misdeeds. Whatever the reason, umbrella punishments slowly disappeared from the record. By the time the Tokugawa era ended in 1868, swept away by the Meiji Restoration, umbrellas had returned to their ordinary role as tools for sun and rain. Their time as instruments of justice had passed. The legacy today. What can you take from this odd practice? First, that societies often choose punishments not only for efficiency but for symbolism. The Tokugawa shogunate relied on public humiliation because it was cheaper, visible, and fit a culture deeply concerned with honor and shame. An umbrella, absurd in its normality, became a stage prop for discipline. Second, The punishment shows how ordinary objects can carry extraordinary meaning. What you see as a harmless umbrella once carried the power to mark someone as a fool, to ruin business, and to stain family honor. The everyday object became a powerful reminder of the weight of social order. Finally, the umbrella punishment illustrates the fine line between correction and cruelty. To some, it was an amusing spectacle. To others, it was a deep wound that lingered long after the public laughter died. When you think about this, you may wonder, how many other objects in history carried such hidden weight? How many tools, garments, or symbols were once used not for their practical purpose, but as instruments of shame and order? The quiet life of a Roman tax collector nobody remembers. Imagine yourself not in the bustling forums of Rome, where senators debated, but in a dusty provincial town somewhere along the edge of the empire. Could be Gaul, Judea, or North Africa. The date may be the 2nd century CE, during the height of Roman power. Marble cities glittered in Italy, but far away in the provinces, ordinary officials performed the daily, tedious work that kept the empire running. One of these officials was the tax collector or publicanus. You probably do not think about him when you imagine Rome. You think of emperors, gladiators, legions, or aqueducts. Yet without men like him, none of it could function. His work was dull, methodical, and often despised. And that is why his story is worth telling. The tax system of Rome. The Roman Empire relied on taxes to fund everything from roads to armies. Taxes came in many forms. Land taxes were the most common, assessed on the size of property and its productivity. Poll taxes required every adult male to pay a fee. Customs duties taxed goods moving across borders or rivers. Even inheritance could be taxed, with Rome demanding a share of estates. In the provinces, tax collection was farmed out to contractors called publicani. Wealthy men, often from the equestrian order, bid for the right to collect taxes in a given region. They paid the government up front, then squeezed as much as they could from the population to make a profit. Beneath them, local collectors and clerks did the actual work, walking fields, measuring grain, weighing goods, and writing down endless figures on wax tablets. It is here, in the hands of these lesser men, that the daily grind of Roman taxation lived. A day in the life. Picture a morning in a provincial town. The sun rises over mud-brick houses. Farmers lead donkeys loaded with olives, figs, or sacks of barley toward the marketplace. Among them stands the tax collector's stall, a wooden table under an awning. A pair of scribes sit nearby, ready with their styluses and wax tablets. The collector greets each farmer with a mixture of authority and weariness. He checks loads, asks questions, and notes details. Some farmers grumble. Others try to negotiate. A few attempt to bribe. The collector listens, weighs, and records. His decisions carry weight, for they can determine whether a family eats well or goes hungry that season. His tools are simple: a balance scale, a wax tablet, a set of wooden measuring rods. Nothing glamorous, yet each essential for turning the produce of an empire into the gold that filled Roman treasuries. The reputation of tax collectors. You must understand that tax collectors were not popular. Roman citizens resented them. Provincial subjects, many of whom had been conquered against their will, despised them even more. In Judea, for example, tax collectors were seen as collaborators with the empire, often grouped with sinners and thieves in local writings. In Gaul, they were mocked as greedy outsiders. Even in Italy, they were distrusted. And yet, they were essential. Roads needed repair, legions demanded pay, and aqueducts required upkeep. Without taxes, Rome would collapse. Tax collectors bore the burden of enforcing this system, enduring the hatred of their neighbors for the sake of imperial stability. Quiet power. Though not glamorous, the collector wielded real influence. He decided how strictly to enforce rules. He could grant leniency to a struggling farmer or crush him with harsh demands. His choices shaped local economies. In some regions, collectors became wealthy by pocketing bribes or taking a share of produce. In others, they lived modestly, earning little beyond survival. Records from Roman Egypt reveal letters where farmers begged collectors for mercy, explaining that floods had ruined crops or that locusts had devoured fields. Sometimes collectors relented, reducing assessments. Other times they did not, pushing villages deeper into debt. The decision lay in the hands of one man, sitting behind a table in a marketplace. The bureaucratic grind. The collector's life was not only about collecting goods. It was about paperwork. Endless paperwork. Wax tablets filled with numbers, names, and notes. Rolls of papyrus stored in archives. Accounts had to be reconciled with regional governors, who in turn reported to Rome. Any mistake could bring punishment. Too much leniency could bring suspicion. Too much harshness could cause unrest. It was a balancing act, and a dull one at that. Imagine copying figures by lamplight, the smell of smoke thick in the air, while your wife and children slept nearby. Day after day, numbers marched across the tablets like an endless army of digits. The human side. Yet the collector was still a man. He worried about his family, his standing, and his safety. Traveling to villages to collect grain exposed him to bandits. Disputes with angry farmers could turn violent. Some collectors traveled with guards. Others relied on local militias. At home, his children likely faced the scorn of neighbors who resented his work. His wife may have lived with the quiet unease of being part of a disliked profession. Still, the family survived, fed by the grain and coin that his hated work provided. Invisible but essential. When you think of Rome's glory, you rarely think of this man. You think of triumphs, marble, and oratory. But behind it all were men like him, scribes, accountants, collectors, who turned produce into empire. Without them, no emperor could have built a forum, no general could have marched a legion, no aqueduct could have carried water. It is boring history, but necessary history. The quiet grind of taxation, the unremembered lives of the men who counted, weighed, and demanded. But here is the question. If so much of Rome's power depended on these obscure figures, why do we remember so little about them today? Why are their names forgotten, while emperors and generals still shine in memory? You now stand deeper inside the world of the Roman tax collector, a man neither loved nor celebrated, but necessary. To understand his life fully, you must see how the machinery of Rome shaped him, how resentment pressed upon him, and how burdens weighed on both sides of the tax table. The burden on the provinces. Imagine yourself as a farmer in Roman Gaul. You till a plot of land your family has worked for generations. The soil is good, the harvest decent, but when the tax collector arrives, a portion of your grain must go to Rome. The collector does not ask if you had a bad year or if pests ate your crop. He measures and records. His stylus scratches into wax, and your burden is fixed. For you, the tax is not just numbers. It is the loss of food that could have fed your family through the winter. It is the reason you must sell a daughter's dowry, or the reason your son must hire himself out as labor. The collector's visit is a reminder that Rome owns not only your land but your future. This resentment simmered everywhere. In Judea, it took on a religious tone. Tax collectors were branded traitors to their people, accused of siding with pagan Rome. In Egypt, papyrus letters reveal farmers pleading with officials, explaining that floods ruined fields. Sometimes the petitions worked. Sometimes the collector dismissed them. Either way, resentment remained. The collector's burden. But step back and see the world from the collector's side. His burden was different but no less heavy. He lived between two powers, the empire above and the people below. Rome demanded quotas, strict and unforgiving. Governors expected revenue to flow without interruption. If the collector failed, suspicion fell on him. He could be fined, imprisoned, or ruined. At the same time, he faced neighbors who despised him. He lived among them, shopped in the same markets, prayed at the same temples. Every time he demanded grain or coin, he risked anger that could spill into violence. Collectors were beaten, sometimes killed, in rural areas. To survive, many traveled with escorts or aligned themselves with local elites. So while farmers cursed him, the collector himself bore the constant fear of failure. Too much cruelty and riots could erupt. Too much mercy and Rome's wrath would descend. His work was a balance beam, narrow and precarious. Everyday tools of control. To keep order, Rome built a bureaucracy of staggering detail. Census records listed names, ages, and property. Surveys measured fields. Tax rolls tracked payments. The collector relied on this machinery. He knew which family owned which plot, which man owed which sum. You can picture him sitting in a dim room, surrounded by wax tablets stacked on wooden shelves. Each tablet marked with notches, filled with names that blurred together. His life was numbers, yet each number represented a real family, a real burden. The dull work of scratching figures was the skeleton that held the empire upright. Publicani and their agents. At the top of the chain were the wealthy publicani, members of the equestrian class who won tax contracts by bidding in Rome. They advanced money to the state, then demanded profits from the provinces. Local collectors like the man you imagine here were their agents. This arrangement bred corruption. The publicani demanded high returns, so agents squeezed harder. Bribes flowed. Farmers sometimes paid extra in secret to reduce assessments. The collector, caught between duty and opportunity, often took his cut. Some became wealthy. Others remained poor, skimming only enough to survive. Rome tolerated corruption to a degree so long as revenue flowed steadily. The collector's reputation might be ruined locally, but if the imperial coffers filled, Rome looked the other way. Cultural views. Roman writers themselves commented on the hatred of tax collectors. Cicero spoke scornfully of publicani as greedy. The historian Tacitus mentioned the burden taxes placed on provinces. In the Gospels, tax collectors appear as examples of sin and dishonor. All of this shaped the collector's image as a figure of resentment, necessary but despised. Yet it is telling that despite this hatred, the system endured for centuries. The empire's survival depended less on legions than on reliable taxation. Armies might conquer, but taxes sustained. And tax collectors, boring as they were the foot soldiers of this invisible war. Hidden stories in the records. Occasionally, the dull records of taxation give us glimpses of human struggle. In papyri from Roman Egypt, you find notes where collectors recorded not just amounts but excuses. Flood ruined field. Plague in village. Man absent, family pays instead. These scraps show you the negotiation, the quiet pleading, and the weary judgment of the collector. Imagine him listening to a farmer insisting that locusts devoured the crop. Does he reduce the assessment, or does he mark full payment due? His decision could tip a family from survival to ruin. Yet his own survival depended on meeting quotas. Each choice carried weight. The quiet architecture of power. Rome's greatness often shines in monuments, arches, temples, amphitheaters. But beneath them ran a quieter architecture. Ledgers, tablets, and taxes. The collector was the mason of that hidden structure. His hammer was his stylus, his bricks were numbers. Without his tedious labor, the arches would crumble, the temples would close, and the legions would starve. You must see him not as a villain, but as a cog in a vast, grinding machine. His life was not glorious. It was dusty, repetitive, and unpopular. Yet in its dullness lay the strength of Rome. An unanswered question. Think now of the collector's legacy. His name is lost. His wax tablets decayed centuries ago. The farmers who cursed him, the families who pleaded with him, all gone. Yet the empire he helped sustain lasted for centuries. So you must ask, if Rome's greatness rested on men like him, why do we remember emperors and generals but not the humble tax collector? Why does history favor the visible glory while forgetting the quiet hands that held it together? You have seen the Roman tax collector at work, standing between empire and subject, hated by his neighbors, pressured by his superiors. Now you must follow him to the end of his quiet life and ask what his existence meant for the world that remembered everything about emperors and generals, but almost nothing about him. The collector at home. Imagine him returning home after a long day at the marketplace. His tunic smells of dust. His wax tablets weigh heavy in his bag. His children greet him, though perhaps shyly. They have heard other children mock their father in the street. His wife places a bowl of lentils before him. He eats in silence, the sounds of evening drifting in from the courtyard. His life outside work is as ordinary as any man of his time. He worries about paying rent to a landlord. He mends sandals. He visits the baths when he can afford it. Yet beneath every simple act lies the tension of his work. He is part of the empire's most unpopular machine, and he knows it. Still, he lives. His children grow. He saves coin where possible. Perhaps he dreams of leaving his post, buying a small plot of land, and fading into the crowd of ordinary farmers. Few men dream of dying a collector. Memory and forgetting. You must now think about how history works. We remember emperors because marble monuments bore their names. We remember generals because they carved victory into stone. But tax collectors left little behind. Their names appeared on fragile wax tablets and papyrus rolls, most long since destroyed. Occasionally, an inscription survives. A dedication from a collector thanking a local deity for survival in a dangerous post, or a small graffito cursing a collector's greed. But for the most part, their lives dissolved into dust. This forgetting is not accidental. Ancient writers often despised tax collectors, so they rarely celebrated them. Farmers cursed them. Officials tolerated them. Neighbors avoided them. And so history followed suit, allowing their names to vanish even as their work sustained everything Rome built. The machinery they sustained. Consider the larger picture. Rome was not just a city of emperors. It was a system of extraction. Grain from Egypt fed Rome. Silver from Spain paid legions. Olive oil from North Africa filled amphorae stacked in Ostia's warehouses. All of it required collectors to weigh, count, and record. Every amphitheater crowd that cheered, every soldier who marched, every senator who schemed in the forum did so on the backs of these quiet men. The collector's dull work, the endless figures, the petty arguments, the weary negotiations, was the foundation of imperial power. Without him, Rome could not pay its soldiers. Without soldiers, it could not defend borders. Without defended borders, Rome could not exist. In this sense, the collector was more vital than many of the figures whose names still echo today. Resistance and rebellion. Sometimes, resentment against taxation boiled over. In Gaul, uprisings erupted when demands grew too heavy. In Judea, taxes fueled revolts that ended in destruction. In Egypt, petitions and riots broke out over assessments. When these moments came, collectors were often the first victims. They represented Rome at its most intrusive. Soldiers and governors could be distant figures. But the collector was there in the village, taking grain from your storehouse. His face became the empire's face. His death was often the spark of rebellion. And yet, rebellion was rare compared to the long stretches of compliance. Most people paid, however grudgingly. Most collectors survived, however disliked. This was the real success of the Roman system, not just conquest, but the grinding, boring stability of taxation. The collector's death. What became of him in the end? Likely nothing dramatic. No assassination, no heroic stand. He probably died in his bed, his body worn by years of labor and worry. His family mourned quietly. His neighbors may have felt relief. His name, scratched into fragile wax and papyrus, faded soon after. No marble bore his likeness. No poet sang his deeds. He left no legacy, except the invisible one shared by thousands like him, the invisible foundation of empire. Reflection. You must now ask yourself, why do we so often forget these men? Why do we celebrate the emperors who demanded taxes but forget the collectors who ensured they arrived? Perhaps it is because their lives were boring. They held no sword, raised no banner, commanded no army. They simply counted, measured, and demanded. But in their boredom lay power. They kept Rome alive. Their tedious figures outlasted battles. Their wax tablets weighed heavier than swords. Their lives, quiet and uncelebrated, remind you that history rests not only on glory but also on the dull persistence of the ordinary. And here is the final thought. If history forgets men like him, what about today? Who are the quiet figures in your world? The clerks, accountants, inspectors, who sustain everything while being remembered by no one. How medieval fishermen measured rivers with ropes and stones. Close your eyes and imagine a wide, slow-moving river in medieval Europe. The year could be 1320 or perhaps 1450. The exact date is not important, because rivers changed little from century to century. Their currents carried silt, fish, and trade. Their banks supported villages of thatched-roof cottages, and wooden boats pulled onto muddy shores. For the people who lived there, the river was life itself, water to drink, fish to eat, and a route for moving goods. But rivers were also unpredictable. Floods could sweep away fields. Shallow waters could strand boats. Currents could hide dangers. To survive, medieval fishermen, boatmen, and villagers developed practical methods for reading rivers. One of the most boring but most essential of these methods was the measuring of depth and current using ropes and stones. The need for measurement. In an age without modern engineering, you could not simply consult a chart. There were no satellites, no maps of precise soundings, no electronic sensors. Knowledge of the river came only through practice. Fishermen needed to know where the water was deep enough to hold fish. Boatmen needed to know if their vessels could pass. Farmers needed to know when floods would rise. So they measured. They did it by hand, with ropes weighted by stones. It was simple, repetitive, and utterly vital. Imagine a fisherman standing in a small wooden boat, the river lapping against its sides. He holds a coil of rope. At the end is tied a smooth, heavy stone. He lowers it into the water, feeling the tug as it sinks. When the stone touches bottom, he marks the rope with his fingers. Pulling it up, he sees the wet length and knows the depth. He notes it quietly, not in writing but in memory. The river is 4 fathoms deep here, perhaps 3 over there. The work of memory. You might think of measurement as something you record on paper. But in medieval Europe, many fishermen and boatmen were illiterate. Their records lived in memory, passed from father to son, from elder to apprentice. A river could be mapped in the mind, marked not by ink but by experience. By the oak tree, 3 fathoms. By the bend near the church, 5 fathoms. By the gravel bank, only 2. This oral mapping formed a shared knowledge that guided entire communities. If you were new to the river, you listened carefully to elders. If you ignored their advice, you risked disaster. Fishing grounds. Depth mattered not only for boats but for fish. Different species lived at different levels. Pike favored shallows near reeds. Salmon ran through deeper channels. Eels hid in muddy bottoms. By lowering stones on ropes, fishermen learned where each species could be found. Sometimes, stones were coated with tallow or sticky resin. When lowered, they picked up mud, sand, or gravel. The fishermen could then examine the bottom without diving. Mud meant eels. Gravel might mean salmon. It was a crude but effective science, developed through generations of practice. Trade and transport. For boatmen carrying goods, measurement was equally important. A boat heavy with grain or wool sat lower in the water. To avoid grounding, the boatman needed to know the depth of channels. He relied on his stone and rope, dropping it again and again as he moved. The sound of splashing stone and wet rope was part of the rhythm of river travel. Some boatmen employed assistants whose sole task was to measure constantly, calling out depths as the vessel moved. Their voices echoed across the water. For fathoms, 3 fathoms, 2 fathoms. A warning cry meant quick action, steering toward deeper waters. Floods and seasons. Rivers changed with seasons. Spring rains swelled them. Summer heat shrank them. Autumn brought floods, winter ice. Fishermen used ropes and stones not only to measure depth but to predict change. If the current grew stronger and the depth rose quickly, they knew floods were coming. Villages prepared, moving livestock and securing goods. These small, boring measurements saved lives and property. Without them, floods struck unprepared, and families starved when fields washed away. Quiet knowledge in a loud world. You may imagine medieval life as loud. Markets bustling, churches ringing bells, wars clashing. But much of it was quiet work, like a fisherman lowering a stone on a rope, listening to the splash, feeling the current. This knowledge never made it into chronicles or royal records. Kings recorded battles. Monks recorded miracles. But no one wrote down the details of how fishermen measured rivers. Yet this forgotten science was as important as any battle. Without it, boats sank, trade stalled, and villages suffered. It was the invisible foundation of survival, built on repetition, patience, and memory. Echoes across cultures. This method was not unique to Europe. Ancient Egyptians measured the Nile with weighted ropes. Arab sailors measured depths along coasts of the Indian Ocean. Chinese boatmen used poles marked with notches. Everywhere water shaped life, people found ways to measure it. The medieval fisherman stood in a long global tradition of practical hydrology, even if he never knew it. An open question. As you imagine him coiling his rope, dripping water across the boat's planks, you must wonder. Did he realize his boring work was part of a system as vital as any king's decree? Did he see himself as a scientist of the river, or simply as a man trying to catch fish? And more importantly, why do we remember knights, kings, and castles, but not the quiet man lowering his stone into the current? Now that you have seen why medieval fishermen measured rivers, you can step closer to the details. How exactly did they do it? What tools did they rely on? And what rhythm of life emerged from repeating the same small act? Dropping a stone, pulling a rope, and reading the depth, day after day, year after year. The rope. The rope was at the center of this practice. In medieval Europe, ropes were made from hemp or flax fibers, twisted together by hand. They were strong enough to withstand constant wetting and drying, but they also wore out quickly. A fisherman might spend part of each winter repairing or remaking his measuring rope. He twisted new fibers, tested knots, and rubbed the finished coil with animal fat or wax to resist rot. Length varied depending on the river. For shallow streams, a few fathoms of rope sufficed. For wide rivers like the Rhine or Danube, ropes stretched longer, sometimes 30 or 40 feet. The rope was not fancy, but its strength and accuracy meant survival. The stone. At the rope's end was a stone. Fishermen chose stones carefully. Smooth, heavy enough to sink quickly, but not so heavy that hauling them up exhausted the arms. Some tied them in cloth nets. Others drilled holes and threaded the rope directly. Over time, stones became polished by use, worn round from constant splashing against riverbeds. Occasionally, fishermen coated stones with tallow. When lowered, these sticky stones brought up sand, mud, or shells. Examining the residue, the fishermen learned the bottom's character: soft mud good for eels, gravel good for spawning salmon. It was a simple method, but surprisingly effective, turning guesswork into practical knowledge. Techniques of measuring. Measuring was not a one-time act. It was constant. Boatmen dropped stones as they traveled, checking channels. Fishermen lowered them at different points along bends or near reed beds. Depths varied daily, sometimes hourly, as currents shifted. One common method was casting. The fishermen swung the stone outward and dropped it at an angle, letting the current pull the rope downstream. By watching how the rope stretched and tugged, he judged the speed of the current as well as the depth. Another method was plumbing, lowering the stone straight down until it struck bottom. Each tug, each splash, carried meaning learned through long practice. The rhythm of the day. Picture a boat drifting at dawn, mist rising from the river. The fisherman coils rope in his hand, drops the stone, listens to the splash, waits, then pulls it up. He repeats this act dozens of times as he moves along the water. His apprentice watches, learning when the rope has slackened, when it has touched bottom, when the current is strong. This rhythm filled entire days. Pulling rope, marking depths, casting nets, hauling fish. Each motion was small, ordinary, but together they made the fisherman a master of his environment. He might not read Latin, but he read the river more fluently than any scholar. Knowledge passed by word and gesture. This knowledge rarely appeared in books. Passed by demonstration. Fathers showed sons. Elders corrected apprentices. A hand on a rope, a nod at the water, a quiet explanation. Here, 2 fathoms. There, shallows. Watch the way the rope pulls. In some regions, special words and phrases developed. A tug at the rope might be called the river's bite. A sudden slackening, the river's sigh. Each term carried practical meaning, embedded in the community's language. Connection to trade. Beyond fishing, this measuring mattered for commerce. Grain barges on the Seine, wine boats on the Rhine, wool rafts in England. All relied on men who knew depths. A merchant's profit depended on whether his boat ran aground. The collector of tolls at a bridge depended on knowing where boats could pass. Without accurate, if boring, measurements, trade slowed. Some towns even employed official river measurers. Their job was to test channels near docks, ensuring safe passage. These men became trusted figures, their ropes and stones as important as a mason's hammer or a miller's wheel. The forgotten science. Modern people might call this hydrology, but medieval people would never have used such a term. To them, it was simply skill. They did not frame it as science, yet it was empirical, careful, and cumulative. Over generations, fishermen built a body of knowledge about rivers as real as any written book. And yet, history rarely mentions it. Chronicles celebrate battles, kings, and saints, not fishermen with ropes. But without them, rivers could not be used safely. Without rivers, towns would wither. The quiet science of measuring made civilization flow as surely as water itself. The endless repetition. There is something meditative in the repetition. Drop the stone, feel the rope, pull it up. Each act takes only a moment, yet repeated 1,000 times, it shapes a life. For the fisherman, this was not boring. It was survival. For history, it was too boring to record. And yet, here lies the paradox. What was too dull to note was what sustained daily life. An open question. As you imagine the fisherman's calloused hands hauling wet rope, you must wonder, did he realize he was part of something larger? Did he see his measurements as shaping trade, safety, and survival, or did he simply see them as one more chore among many? And more curiously, what other forgotten sciences, hidden in repetition and dullness, shaped medieval life as much as this quiet reading of the rivers? You now know the tools and rhythms of medieval fishermen, the ropes and stones, the endless lowering and lifting, the quiet reading of rivers. But what happened to this knowledge over time? How did it live in memory, shape communities, and then vanish from history's record? Knowledge in the community. In a medieval riverside village, knowledge of depths was not private. It belonged to the community. The river was a shared space, and survival depended on collective memory. When floods rose, when currents shifted, when fish patterns changed, word spread quickly. You can imagine villagers gathered at dusk near the riverbank, trading stories. One man reports the channel deepened near the old mill. Another warns that shallows formed near the willow bend. Young men listen closely, learning the river not from books but from talk. Every fisherman carried a map in his mind, but that map was built from voices, gestures, and experience shared across generations. The fragility of memory. But memory is fragile. Unlike stone bridges or carved charters, the oral maps of rivers left no trace once voices fell silent. When a fisherman died, his precise sense of a channel, his knowledge of where gravel met mud, often died with him unless he had passed it on. In times of plague or war, when entire communities collapsed, knowledge could vanish quickly. Survivors might return to rivers but find them strange, dangerous, unfamiliar. Channels shifted in their absence. Stones and ropes dropped again, and the slow work of measuring began anew. The seasonal calendar. Measuring rivers was not only daily work but seasonal work. Fishermen marked their lives by rhythms of floods and droughts. In spring, swollen waters demanded caution. Stones sank deeper, ropes stretched farther. In summer, rivers shrank. Measurements shortened. Fish crowded in deeper pools. In autumn, rains raised waters again, bringing both danger and abundance. Winter froze surfaces, but beneath the ice, currents still moved. Each season wrote itself into the rope and stone, into memory. Measurements became not only practical but predictive. A fisherman who noticed depths rising too quickly might warn of flood. A man who knew a shallow pool shrinking might predict famine for eels. This calendar, silent and precise, ordered village life. The broader web of society. The work of measuring rivers connected to larger systems. Fishermen ensured food. Boatmen ensured trade. Toll collectors ensured taxes. Millers relied on water levels for grinding grain. All of them needed measurements. A single man lowering a stone into water contributed to a web of survival reaching far beyond his boat. His act, boring in isolation, shaped economies. He was an unseen link in the long chain of medieval subsistence. Religious and cultural overlays. Religion, too, colored this knowledge. In many regions, rivers carried sacred meaning. Priests blessed waters. Monks recorded floods as signs from God. Fishermen, lowering stones, sometimes muttered prayers, seeking safety from drowning. Depths were not only numbers but mysteries. The river could feed, but it could also kill. In art and song, rivers appeared often as metaphors, but the practical work of measurement remained uncelebrated. It was too dull, too ordinary, too essential. And yet, without it, the poetic image of rivers as life-giving could not have survived in reality. The slow disappearance. As Europe moved toward the late medieval and early modern periods, new tools appeared. Written records of waterways increased. Maps began to include depths. Engineers planned canals with measured precision. Slowly, The communal memory of ropes and stones was replaced by documents and charts. By the 17th century, professional surveyors measured rivers with poles and chains, leaving records in archives. The old methods did not vanish immediately. Fishermen continued to drop stones, but they were overshadowed by official data. The living memory of depths, once the lifeblood of riverside communities, became a minor skill, then a forgotten one. The trace left behind. Today you find only traces. A passing note in a medieval chronicle that a fisherman plumbed the depth. A marginal drawing in a monastic manuscript showing a man with a rope and stone. Fragments, small and uncelebrated. And yet, these fragments remind you that most of history's work was like this, quiet, repetitive, unrecorded. The great castles and cathedrals may dominate the skyline of memory, but they rested on a foundation of dull labor, like a fisherman measuring water he would never control. Reflection. You must now ask, what does it mean that such knowledge vanished almost without trace? Was it less important because it left no monument? Or was it more important because it sustained lives so completely that no one thought to record it? The fisherman, lowering his stone into water, probably never thought of legacy. He thought only of fish, of safety, of feeding his family. And yet, in his boring act, he shaped the possibility of survival for his village. The final question. So, as you think of this quiet science, ask yourself, if our world remembers kings and knights but forgets fishermen with ropes, how much of the true fabric of history has slipped away into silence, carried off like silt in a river's current? The entire career of a Byzantine palace eunuch. Imagine Constantinople in the 10th century. The morning sun rises over the domes of Hagia Sophia. Seagulls circle above the harbor, where ships from the Black Sea unload grain, wine, and silk. Inside the palace complex, beyond gates guarded by soldiers and walls painted with mosaics, a man prepares for his day's work. He wears fine robes but no sword. He commands respect, but no family line will carry his name forward. He is a eunuch, one of the most distinctive figures in Byzantine history. Who were the eunuchs? In the Byzantine Empire, eunuchs were men who had been castrated, often as children or adolescents, sometimes by choice of their families, sometimes by force. They were barred from marrying and producing legitimate heirs. Yet this loss, which excluded them from ordinary life, opened unusual doors. Eunuchs filled roles close to the emperor within the palace, where loyalty was measured not by lineage but by service. In a society where dynasties and family ties often threatened imperial power, eunuchs were seen as safe. They could not found rival houses. They could not pass offices to sons. Their careers depended entirely on imperial favor. That made them invaluable servants, advisors, generals, and administrators. Entering the palace. Our imagined eunuch begins life in the provinces, perhaps in Anatolia or the Balkans. His family, poor but ambitious, surrenders him to palace service. Castrated at a young age, he is raised within the palace walls, trained in literacy, ceremony, and administration. By the time he is a young man, he knows the palace better than the streets of his birthplace. Life in the palace is structured, rigid, and ceremonial. Eunuchs serve in the bedchamber of the emperor, in the treasury, in the secretariat. They carry messages, oversee rituals, and guard the emperor's privacy. Over time, their knowledge of court routines becomes unmatched. They know who enters which door, which hour is best to approach the emperor, which ritual gesture carries hidden meaning. The quiet power of access. Power in Byzantium often lay not in titles but in access. To speak with the emperor, one needed a gatekeeper. Eunuchs were those gatekeepers. They decided who waited, who entered, who whispered in the emperor's ear. They were not warriors, but they shaped war by influencing decisions. They were not landowners, but they shaped land policy by drafting decrees. Our eunuch rises in this system. He begins as a chamberlain, attending to the emperor's daily needs. His loyalty and intelligence are noticed. He advances to positions in the imperial secretariat, where he learns to draft official documents, seal letters, and manage correspondence with provincial governors. Slowly, his career builds, not through inheritance, but through quiet service. Distrusted but needed. The position of eunuchs was paradoxical. They were distrusted by many. Church leaders sometimes condemned their existence. Aristocrats mocked them as unnatural. Soldiers doubted their courage. Yet emperors relied on them. Without eunuchs, the palace machinery stalled. Documents could not be drafted. Ceremonies could not be arranged. Private counsel could not be trusted. This tension gave eunuchs a strange kind of power. They could be mocked in public yet feared in private. Satirical writings compared them to foxes, cunning, sly, but essential. Chroniclers often blamed them for palace intrigues, even when they were only following orders. They were both invisible and indispensable. The career path. A successful eunuch's career could follow many routes. Some rose to become parakoimimenos, the chief chamberlain, one of the most powerful offices in Byzantium. Others became generals, leading armies despite their lack of heirs. Still others managed the treasury, overseeing the flow of gold that sustained the empire. Our eunuch, in this story, follows the administrative path. He learns languages, reads petitions, manages palace correspondence. He grows older, and with age comes authority. By middle life, he is entrusted with audiences, introducing ambassadors to the emperor, guiding them through Byzantine ritual, ensuring they leave impressed by imperial magnificence. Life without family. Yet his life is also lonely. Eunuchs could not marry legally, though some formed partnerships or adopted heirs informally. Many lived with a sense of separation from ordinary life. They could not pass on property easily. Their names rarely survived in family lines. What they left instead were careers, decrees signed, ceremonies arranged, influence whispered into the ear of emperors. This gave their lives a strange mix of transience and permanence. Their bodies were marked forever by castration. Their family lines ended with them. Yet their actions shaped history in ways far more lasting than the names of many ordinary nobles. The question of power. As our eunuch advances, he becomes a man others must approach carefully. Ambassadors know that a kind word to him may smooth the path to the emperor. Generals know that his whisper may tip the emperor's decision on war. Aristocrats resent him, but they cannot ignore him. He holds no sword, yet his presence shapes decisions as surely as an army. And here lies the contradiction. The man mocked as unnatural holds one of the most natural forms of power, the power of proximity, of access, of trust. An open question. But what does this mean for how we understand Byzantine history? Did eunuchs wield power because they were weak, or because their weakness made them indispensable? Were they truly loyal servants, or masters of subtle manipulation? And what does it say about a society that placed some of its most important decisions not in the hands of generals or nobles, but in the hands of men who stood forever at the margins of ordinary life? You now stand with our eunuch not at the beginning of his career, but in its middle, when influence grows heavier and dangers multiply. His daily life is no longer confined to menial service. He now manages ceremony, interprets ritual, and moves within the quiet machinery of intrigue that defined Byzantine politics. Ceremony as power. In Byzantium, ceremony was not decoration, it was politics. Every step, gesture, and phrase reinforced imperial authority. When foreign ambassadors arrived, they passed through halls lined with golden mosaics, mechanical lions that roared, and gilded trees with singing birds. These spectacles were carefully orchestrated, and eunuchs were the stage managers. Our eunuch now directs such ceremonies. He instructs ambassadors where to bow, how to speak, when to kneel. He makes sure their gifts are displayed properly, their requests handled delicately. His work appears boring, the quiet logistics of ritual, but it carries immense weight. A mistake could insult a foreign power. A well-executed ceremony could awe them into submission. Behind the emperor's majesty stood the eunuch's meticulous planning. His notes, his whispered instructions, his hand ensuring order. He does not appear in chronicles describing the glittering spectacle, yet without him the spectacle would collapse. The world of intrigue. Byzantine politics was notorious for intrigue. Plots, poisonings, coups, and whispered betrayals were common. Eunuchs, always near the emperor, were accused often of manipulating events. Some certainly did. Others became scapegoats. Our eunuch, now trusted in the palace, learns to survive in this dangerous climate. He listens more than he speaks. He delivers messages carefully, ensuring each word is remembered exactly. He keeps secrets, sometimes too many. To one faction he appears loyal, to another cautious. His true loyalty remains to the emperor, but appearances are everything. He understands the danger. A single accusation of conspiracy could end his career or his life. Some eunuchs were blinded, exiled, or executed when accused of treachery. Survival required patience, restraint, and silence. The machinery of paperwork. Beyond intrigue, daily work consumed him. Byzantine administration produced mountains of documents, petitions, decrees, tax orders, military commands. The eunuch managed this flow. He read petitions from distant provinces, summarized them for the emperor, and ensured decisions became written orders. This bureaucratic grind was dull, but crucial. Without it, armies starved, taxes failed, and governors grew rebellious. Our eunuch spent hours hunched over parchment, dictating to scribes, reviewing seals, checking accuracy. A single error could trigger disaster in a province far away. It was not glorious, but it was power of a different kind. The power to decide which petitions reached the emperor's eyes, which words were softened, which were emphasized. The emperor trusted him to filter information, and in that trust lay influence invisible to most. The whispered word. By middle age, the eunuch gained his greatest weapon, the whispered word. To be in the emperor's bedchamber or antechamber was to hold a key to decision-making. When a general requested reinforcements, it was the eunuch who summarized the matter for the emperor. When a noble petitioned for favor, it was the eunuch who presented the request. A subtle emphasis, a slight hesitation, could sway outcomes. He did not raise armies, yet he decided whether armies marched. He did not draft treaties, yet he influenced which treaties were signed. Power lay not in public speeches but in quiet conversations, spoken between gilded walls, where only the emperor and his eunuch stood. Distrust from others. Yet such influence bred resentment. Aristocrats despised him. They whispered that men like him corrupted emperors, that their unnatural status made them cunning. Monks railed against them as symbols of moral weakness. Soldiers grumbled that soft-handed eunuchs shaped policies of war. Satirical writers mocked eunuchs as half-men, sly foxes, or serpents in silk robes. To many, they embodied the suspicion that power in Byzantium was not in noble blood or military valor but in manipulation behind curtains. Our eunuch bore this hatred with patience. He knew it could not be escaped. His only protection was the emperor's trust. As long as that trust remained, he survived. Moments of crisis. At times, his role became visible during crisis. Imagine a coup attempt when soldiers stormed the palace. The eunuch stood at the emperor's side, locking doors, organizing guards, perhaps even negotiating with rebels. Chronicles mention eunuchs carrying imperial regalia to safety, hiding treasures, or smuggling messages out of besieged palaces. In calmer times, his crisis was quieter, managing shortages of coin, smoothing over disputes between generals, ensuring taxes arrived on time. These tasks did not inspire poets, but they sustained empire. Aging into authority. As years passed, our eunuch grew older. His hair thinned, his steps slowed, but his authority deepened. Younger courtiers now approached him for guidance. Ambassadors flattered him, knowing he was the path to the emperor. His career had become its own kind of family. No children, no heirs, but networks of clients and dependents. For him, survival was success. He had endured mockery, suspicion, and endless dull work. He had no monument, but his fingerprints lay on countless documents, treaties, and policies. An open question, and here you must pause. Was his influence real power, or only borrowed light from the emperor's sun? Did he shape history, or only serve as a shadow, repeating what others decided? If emperors ruled in public and generals fought in fields, what role did this quiet eunuch, forever barred from ordinary life, truly play in shaping the Byzantine Empire? You have followed the eunuch from childhood training to middle-age influence, from ceremonies that awed ambassadors to whispered words that shaped imperial decisions. Now you must consider the end of his career, the nature of his legacy, and why history, which so often magnifies emperors and generals, leaves men like him in the shadows. The final years. In his later years, our eunuch no longer rushed through palace corridors. His steps slowed. His voice, once sharp in ceremony, grew softer. Yet his importance did not vanish. Age brought authority. His experience made him a source of stability in a court always threatened by intrigue. He had seen emperors rise and fall. Some he served faithfully for decades. Others fell to coups within months. Through it all, he survived, not because he commanded armies, but because he understood the delicate art of service. Neither too ambitious nor too submissive, always loyal but never naive. When younger courtiers whispered of plots, he listened silently. When ambassadors pressed for favors, he remembered old lessons. Never promise more than the emperor would give. Never reveal more than necessary. His greatest skill was restraint, retirement or removal. Few eunuchs retired in comfort. Many died in service, still attending to rituals in their 60s or 70s. Others, when emperors lost trust, were exiled to monasteries. Some were blinded or humiliated in public purges. The eunuch's career was always precarious. Our eunuch, in this story, avoided disgrace. He lived long enough to withdraw quietly, granted a modest estate near Constantinople. There he spent his final years overseeing servants, visiting churches, and remembering a life lived within palace walls. His name faded from gossip as new eunuchs rose to prominence. The empire never stopped producing men like him. Legacy without heirs. Unlike aristocrats, he left no children to carry on his name. No family line remembered him. His estate, when he died, returned to the crown. The only trace of his existence lived in documents, petitions bearing his seal, decrees he summarized, ceremonial protocols he arranged. To his neighbors, he was just another retired official, remembered vaguely for his service. To historians centuries later, he became invisible. Unless a chronicler mentioned him in passing, his name dissolved. This is the paradox of eunuchs. Immense influence in life, almost no legacy in memory. They shaped policies, guarded emperors, and orchestrated diplomacy. Yet history swallowed them quietly. Eunuchs as a class. Though individuals faded, eunuchs as a class left a mark. Byzantine society depended on them. They served as generals, admirals, financiers, chamberlains. Some, like the powerful Basil Lecapinos in the 10th century, effectively ruled as regents. Others controlled the treasury for decades. Collectively, they were pillars of empire. But their presence also revealed Byzantium's anxieties. Emperors trusted them because they had no heirs. Aristocrats distrusted them because they held power without lineage. Their existence highlighted the tension between family and empire, between private inheritance and public service. The view from the church. The church's view was conflicted. On one hand, eunuchs embodied sacrifice, separated from ordinary desires. Some became monks or saints, praised for chastity. On the other, their castration was condemned as unnatural. Preachers scolded their influence in court, warning that weak men whispered in emperors' ears. Our eunuch, like many, lived in this tension, respected in practice, condemned in theory. The contradiction never disappeared. Disappearance in history. By the late Byzantine period, eunuchs remained in palace service, but their influence waned as the empire shrank. After 1453, when Constantinople fell to the Ottomans, the Byzantine eunuch class vanished entirely. The Ottomans employed their own eunuchs, but the Byzantine tradition ended. Today, only fragments remain. Passing mentions in chronicles, occasional seals, scattered anecdotes of intrigue. Their careers, so vital in their time, became footnotes. Reflection. What does this tell you about history? That it often remembers the spectacular, battles, emperors, monuments, while forgetting the ordinary yet essential machinery of governance. Eunuchs were boring in the sense that their work was repetitive, ceremonial, and bureaucratic. Yet without them, the palace could not function. Their careers raise a deeper question. How much of history is built on the shoulders of those we forget? The eunuch, invisible in chronicles, shaped the lives of emperors who are remembered in marble. His silence sustained their noise. A final question. As you think of this man's quiet end, you must ask, if power can exist without memory, if entire lives of influence can vanish into silence, then how many other forgotten figures shaped history, only to leave no trace beyond the dull machinery of survival? The forgotten Incan system of not counting, the quipu. Imagine yourself standing in the highlands of the Andes in the 15th century. The air is thin, the mountains stretch endlessly, and terraces of maize and potatoes cut across steep slopes. Villages cling to valleys, linked by narrow roads where messengers run with astonishing speed. This is the world of the Inca Empire, Tawantinsuyu, which stretched thousands of miles from modern-day Colombia to Chile. The Incas ruled without writing. No alphabet, no scrolls, no parchment. And yet, they administered an empire of millions. How? With ropes, strings, and knots, an object known as the quipu. What was a quipu? A quipu, sometimes called a talking knot, was a bundle of cords. At the center hung a main string, usually thick, from which dangled dozens or even hundreds of thinner cords. Each cord bore knots tied at different positions. Some cords were dyed, others twisted in specific directions. The arrangement encoded information, numbers, categories, perhaps even stories. To you, it might look like nothing more than a tangle of threads. But to a trained Inca administrator, a quipu carried the weight of census rolls, tax ledgers, and harvest records. It was the bureaucracy of empire reduced to fibers and knots. Counting without writing. The Incas managed vast resources. Maize, potatoes, llamas, textiles, and labor. To track them, they relied on the quipu. A decimal system formed its base. Knots tied in groups represented units, tens, hundreds, thousands. The position of a knot along the cord mattered, as did the type of knot. A single loop might mean 1. A long knot with several turns might mean 5. Imagine a census taker arriving in a mountain village. He asks how many households live there, how many llamas they own, how much maize they produce. Instead of writing, he ties knots. 1 knot here, 5 knots there, a different color cord for maize, another for potatoes. Within minutes, the entire productivity of the village is stored on strings. The quipu was portable, durable, and suited to a world without paper. Messengers, called chaskis, carried them along roads, running from post to post. A quipu could travel hundreds of miles, arriving intact, ready to be read by another trained official. The keepers of knots, specialists known as quipukamaics, literally, keepers of the quipu, were trained to create and read these cords. They were not ordinary villagers. They held positions of respect, serving as accountants, census takers, and archivists of empire. They memorized not only the meaning of knots but the categories behind them. A quipu showing a number was not enough. One had to know whether the number referred to maize, laborers, or llamas. The quipukamaic carried that knowledge. Without him, the knots were silent. With him, they spoke volumes. Training was demanding. Boys chosen for this role studied under elders, learning to tie, read, and interpret chords. Memory and discipline were crucial. Many quipukamaics spent their entire lives in service, trusted by officials to record the truth of the empire's wealth. Empire by numbers. The scale of what quipus recorded is staggering. When the Incas mobilized labor for building roads or terraces, they did so by counting households on quipus. When they gathered food for storehouses, they knew exactly how much each village produced. When they prepared armies, they calculated how many men could be drawn from each region. It was boring work, counting potatoes, recording llamas, but it made possible the extraordinary achievements of Inca engineering. Every terrace, every storehouse, every road rested on the dull, precise records of knots. Not just numbers. Some scholars believe quipus went beyond numbers. Color coding, chord arrangement, and knot styles may have carried narrative or symbolic meaning. A red cord might indicate warriors, a yellow cord maize, a green cord coca leaves. Some quipus seem to follow patterns that suggest storytelling. If true, the quipu was not only an abacus but a form of writing, different from alphabets, but capable of recording complex knowledge. Unfortunately, much of this system is lost. After the Spanish conquest, missionaries destroyed many quipus, seeing them as pagan tools. Of the thousands that once existed, only a few hundred survive today. The texture of daily life. Think of the villager seeing a quipu unfurled. To him, it was a sign of state authority. Each knot represented obligations, tribute, labor, or goods owed, but it also represented security. The quipu ensured fairness, preventing officials from inventing demands. If the quipu showed 10 llamas, the villager owed 10, not 12. In a world without written contracts, the knots served as proof. For the quipukamaic, the quipu was more than thread. It was memory externalized, a way to hold the life of the village in chords. He touched each knot, recalled each category, and spoke numbers aloud. His voice translated fiber into fact. The boring miracle. To you, this may sound tedious. Tying knots, checking colors, memorizing categories. But consider the miracle of it. An empire with no alphabet managed to govern millions, mobilize armies, and feed cities, all through this boring, repetitive act. The quipu was not dramatic. It was not poetic. But it was functional, efficient, and quietly brilliant. An open question. And here lies the mystery. Were quipus purely numerical, or did they hide stories, histories, and myths within their knots? Did entire epics, like those sung by Inca poets, once live encoded in chords now silent? If so, then the forgotten quipu was not just a ledger of potatoes and llamas, but a lost library of empire. You have seen the quipu as a tool of counting and memory, but now you must step deeper into its role within the machinery of the Inca Empire. It was not simply a curiosity of chords and knots. It was the backbone of administration, a device that shaped daily life for millions across mountains and valleys. The empire's need for order. The Inca Empire stretched across deserts, mountains, and jungles. It included dozens of languages, hundreds of ethnic groups, and landscapes so harsh that only extraordinary organization could sustain life. To rule this diversity, the Incas relied on strict control. At the center was the mita system, a form of labor tax. Every community owed service, building roads, farming state lands, weaving cloth, or serving in the army. To track these obligations, officials needed accurate counts of households, workers, and resources. Without a written language, the empire turned to quipus. A quipu could show how many men of fighting age lived in one valley, how many women wove cloth in another, and how much maize a third produced. It turned scattered villages into calculable units, manageable by distant rulers in Cusco. How quipus were made. The cords of a quipu were not random. Colors were chosen carefully. Brown might mean earth, yellow maize, white silver, red warriors. Fibers came from cotton in coastal areas or alpaca and llama wool in the highlands. Some cords twisted to the left, others to the right. These directions, known as S and Z twists, may have carried meaning as well. Knots followed a decimal system. Ones, tens, hundreds, and thousands could all be tied on the same cord, each in its position. A single quipu could hold thousands of numbers. It was, in essence, a portable database carried by hand, updated by knots. The act of making a quipu was slow. A Quipucamaic sat with cords laid out before him. He tied carefully, checked positions, counted, tied again. Apprentices watched, learning not only the knots but the rhythm of accuracy. Each mistake risked disorder in the records of empire. Reading the knots. Reading a quipu required touch as much as sight. Fingers ran along cords, feeling knots, noting positions. The Quipucamaic recited aloud as he read, translating knots into spoken numbers. For villagers listening, the quipu was almost magical. Out of silent threads came knowledge. How many men would serve in the next mita? How much maize must be delivered to the state storehouse? How many llamas were owed? This was not casual knowledge. The quipu's authority was binding. Villages lived and died by its knots. Storehouses and roads. The quipu connected directly to the empire's physical infrastructure. The Incas built thousands of storehouses, filled with maize, dried potatoes, beans, and cloth. These supplies fed armies, sustained workers, and prepared for famine. To manage them, officials needed records of quantities moving in and out. Quipus tracked these flows. One set of cords might record maize delivered by one village. Another set recorded cloth woven by another. By tying, untying, and readying knots, officials updated the state of the storehouses. Along the empire's 25,000-mile road system, chasquis carried quipus between posts. A message might travel from Quito to Cusco in days, passed from runner to runner, each carrying knots that spoke across mountains. The human element. But the quipu was never only strings. It required the Quipucamaic. His skill determined its accuracy. He remembered not just numbers but categories. A knot of 50 meant nothing unless he explained whether it referred to potatoes, warriors, or cloth. This reliance on human memory was both strength and weakness. It allowed flexibility. Quipucamaics could adjust systems for local needs. But it also meant vulnerability. If one died unexpectedly, his knowledge of categories could vanish, leaving cords indecipherable. To prevent loss, communities trained multiple keepers. In large provinces, dozens of Quipucamaics worked together, cross-checking one another's knots. Their boring work, recounting, retesting, repeating, was what kept the empire's order intact. Spanish encounter. When the Spanish arrived in the 1530s, They were baffled by quipus. To them, knots were toys, not records. Missionaries called them heathen. Some saw their potential but distrusted their alien logic. Most were destroyed in bonfires, erased as part of campaigns against Inca traditions. Yet even Spaniards eventually realized their importance. Colonial officials sometimes employed surviving Quipicameacs to help with censuses. In remote Andean villages, knots were still used for decades, even centuries after conquest. Lost in translation. Today, only fragments remain. About 800 quipus survive in museums and collections. Scholars study them, counting knots, comparing colors, searching for patterns. Some discoveries confirm their use as numerical ledgers. Others suggest more. One quipu appears to record a census in detail, another perhaps a story. But the key is missing. Without living Quipicameacs, interpretation is guesswork. The chords hold silence where voices once explained. The empire's memory sits knotted, waiting, but mostly forgotten. Reflection. Think of this for a moment. An empire governed not by parchment but by thread. The quipu was dull in appearance, tedious in creation, but powerful in use. Its knots bound not just cords but lives, tying together households, villages, and provinces into the fabric of empire. And you must ask, was the quipu simply a ledger, or was it a lost form of writing? Did entire histories lie knotted into cords now unreadable? You have seen the quipu in the hands of officials and runners, tying together the empire's vast territories with cords of data. But now you must follow its fate, what happened after conquest, how traces of it lingered, and what it means for history that such a powerful tool was nearly erased from memory. The fall of an empire. When the Spanish entered the Andes in the 1530s, they encountered an empire already fragile from civil war and epidemic. Yet its systems still functioned. Roads carried messages, storehouses held food, and quipus recorded obligations. For a brief moment, conquerors and conquered met across a gulf of culture, one with parchment and pens, the other with cords and knots. To the Spaniards, quipus were suspicious. They asked what messages hid in the knots. Were they prayers to old gods, records of tribute, or secret plans for rebellion? Missionaries destroyed many, fearing they carried idolatry. Whole archives of cords, perhaps numbering in the thousands, vanished in flames. What survived were fragments, scattered and silenced. Colonial uses. And yet, quipus did not disappear overnight. Spanish officials, confronted with the practical problem of counting people and resources, sometimes relied on Quipicameacs. They called them to testify in colonial courts, their cords serving as evidence in disputes over land or tribute. For decades, even into the 17th century, Andean communities maintained quipus as parallel records. One colonial account describes a trial where villagers presented a quipu to prove how much tribute had been paid. Spanish scribes recorded the knots into their own ledgers. The cords and the parchment stood side by side, two systems of order overlapping. Survival in villages. Even after quipus faded from official use, echoes remained in villages. Oral traditions spoke of ancestors who read cords. In some remote regions, simplified quipus continued into the 19th century, used to record debts or rituals. The system never entirely died. It transformed, hidden within local memory. But without the state infrastructure, the full meaning of knots slipped away. Categories blurred, techniques lost clarity. A device once capable of sustaining empire became only a shadow of itself, remembered vaguely as the old system. Modern rediscovery. Today, archaeologists and historians study surviving quipus with digital tools. They scan knots, catalog cord colors, and compare patterns. Some quipus clearly record numbers, censuses, tribute lists, warehouse inventories. Others resist interpretation. A few seem to follow narrative structures, with patterns too complex to be mere accounting. One hypothesis suggests that quipus combine numbers with narrative, storing not just how many, but what kind. If true, they were more than ledgers, they were a woven form of writing. The Andes may have had a lost literature tied into chords now unreadable. The boring brilliance. Even if quipus were only numerical, their brilliance remains. They offered a way to govern without writing, suited perfectly to the Inca world. In a mountainous land where paper would rot, chords survived. In an empire without wheels or metal presses, knots carried information across thousands of miles. It was boring, repetitive work. Tying knots, checking chords, but in its dullness lay empire. Quipukamaics, like Roman tax collectors or Japanese magistrates, did not live glorious lives. They tied chords, recited numbers, answered officials. Their names are gone, their voices silenced. Yet they sustained one of the largest empires in the pre-Columbian world. Reflection. Think about the silence left behind. When a Quipukamaic died, his chords could outlive him, but without his voice, they fell mute. History lost not only individuals but the meanings woven into thread. Today you see knots without explanations, chords without categories. The empire's memory remains tied but unspoken. And here is the final question. What other systems, boring in their time but vital to survival, have been erased so completely? If knots once held the history of millions, how much of humanity's past lies knotted, burned, or forgotten? Why early Chinese farmers raised silkworms in their bedrooms. Imagine a small village in ancient China, perhaps during the Han Dynasty around the 2nd century BCE. Mud brick houses line narrow paths, smoke drifts from kitchen fires, and chickens scratch in the dirt. Inside one of these modest homes, in the quiet corner of a bedroom, wooden trays sit piled with mulberry leaves. On those leaves crawl hundreds of tiny white worms. This is not a nightmare, nor a curiosity. It is the center of a household economy, the raising of silkworms. Silk as a lifeline. Silk was not just fabric. It was currency, tax, tribute, and diplomacy. Soldiers were sometimes paid in silk. Officials accepted silk as tax. Emperors gifted silk to foreign rulers. Entire economies turned on this shimmering thread. And at its beginning lay the silkworm, a fragile creature that depended entirely on human care. For farmers, especially women, raising silkworms was both duty and survival. Silk gave them status, brought income, and linked their homes to the empire's power. Without silkworms, there was no silk. Without silk, much of China's wealth and diplomacy would unravel. Why bedrooms? Silkworms are delicate. They thrive only in narrow conditions. Too cold and they die. Too hot and they wither. Drafts sicken them. Sudden noise startles them. Even the smell of smoke or perfume could disturb their feeding. To keep them alive, farmers placed them in the safest, most controlled space available, the family bedroom. The bedroom was warm, protected, and relatively free from drafts. Farmers slept beside their worms, listening to the faint rustle of hundreds of tiny mouths chewing mulberry leaves. It was a strange intimacy. People and worms sharing space, bound by necessity. The work of feeding. Silkworms are voracious. A single worm can eat its weight in mulberry leaves daily. Families spent hours gathering leaves from mulberry trees, cutting them into small pieces, and spreading them on trays. The worms ate constantly, growing from tiny black specks to plump white caterpillars as thick as a finger. Feeding was relentless. Morning, noon, evening, always fresh leaves. Children carried baskets of leaves from groves. Mothers cut them into strips, and everyone tended the trays. The sound of chewing filled the room, a soft, steady rhythm like rain on paper. Cleaning and care. Raising silkworms was not only about feeding. Their trays had to be kept clean. Worm droppings collected quickly, dampening the leaves and spreading disease. Farmers carefully lifted worms onto fresh leaves, replaced soiled trays, and burned the waste outside. Care extended to sound and smell. Loud noises could disturb worms, slowing their growth. Strong odors, like garlic or smoke, were avoided in the house. Families learned to speak softly near the trays, moving gently, living quietly for the sake of their worms. The moment of transformation. After weeks of feeding, the worms began to spin cocoons. Each worm extruded a continuous filament of silk, winding it into a protective shell. Farmers watched carefully, for timing was everything. If the worm completed its life cycle and emerged as a moth, it broke the filament, ruining the silk. To preserve the thread, farmers had to collect cocoons at the right moment. This task was both precise and brutal. Cocoons were harvested and boiled, killing the worm inside but loosening the filament. The silk was then unwound, sometimes stretching thousands of feet from a single cocoon. From the intimacy of the bedroom came thread fine enough to clothe emperors. The role of women. Sericulture, the art of raising silkworms, was traditionally women's work. Texts describe empresses leading ceremonies of silk production, symbolizing female labor's importance. In villages, wives and daughters took primary responsibility, though the entire household contributed. This labor was demanding and often hidden. While men worked fields, women bent over trays of worms, their hands smelling of mulberry leaves, their nights filled with the sound of chewing. The empire's silk economy rested on their quiet diligence. Silk and empire. The threads spun in bedrooms did not stay in villages. They traveled along roads, through markets, into imperial storehouses. From there, bolts of silk moved westward, reaching Central Asia, India, and eventually Rome. To distant traders, silk was luxury. To Chinese farmers, it was the product of weeks of sleepless nights, careful feeding, and sharing a bedroom with worms. It was boring, repetitive work, but its consequences were global. Without it, the Silk Road would have been nameless. An open question. As you imagine farmers lying on mats, worms rustling on trays beside them, you must wonder. Did they see themselves as part of empire, or simply as caretakers of fragile lives? Did they know their worms linked them to kings, generals, and traders thousands of miles away? And why does history remember the shimmering cloth but not the quiet households where worms and humans lived side by side? You now know that silkworms lived in the bedrooms of farmers, cared for with tenderness and vigilance. But to understand the full weight of this practice, you must see the rhythms of labor, the rituals that surrounded it, and the risks that haunted every cycle. Sericulture was not simply a household chore. It was a discipline, a tradition, and sometimes a gamble against nature itself. Rituals of silk. In early China, silk production was wrapped in ritual as much as in thread. Texts describe empresses leading ceremonies at mulberry groves each spring, symbolizing women's role in nurturing silkworms. These ceremonies honored not only the worms but the labor of women across the empire. Farmers also observed local customs. Before moving worms into bedrooms, families sometimes burned incense to protect them from disease. Offerings of wine or food were placed near trays, asking ancestors for blessing. Some regions held festivals marking the first appearance of cocoons, blending work with celebration. The rituals were not superstition alone. They gave meaning to tedious labor, binding households into the empire's rhythm of silk. The cycle of labor. Sericulture followed a predictable cycle, tied to seasons. In spring, mulberry trees budded, and families rushed to gather fresh leaves. Worms hatched from tiny black eggs, no larger than sesame seeds. Farmers carefully placed them on trays, feeding them soft young leaves. As weeks passed, the worms grew. Their appetites multiplied. Families rose before dawn to cut branches, stripped leaves by hand, and returned to feed worms before breakfast. By midday, leaves were collected again. By evening, another round. The cycle repeated, relentless, for nearly a month. Children helped where they could, but responsibility lay with women. Their hands grew stained green from mulberry juice. Their backs ached from bending. At night, they lay exhausted beside the steady rustle of worms eating in the dark. Risks and losses. Silkworms were fragile. Sudden changes in temperature could kill them. A cold wind slipping through a crack, a fire burning too close, even the smoke of cooking could ruin trays. Diseases spread quickly, wiping out entire batches. A month's work could vanish in days. Because of these risks, farmers guarded their worms like infants. Bedrooms were swept clean. Strangers were kept away. Noise was hushed. Families sometimes refrained from certain foods or activities believed to disturb worms. Every effort went into shielding the fragile creatures that represented both survival and wealth. The harvest of cocoons. When worms fattened and began to spin, tension rose. Timing mattered. If left too long, moths would emerge, breaking silk threads. If harvested too soon, filaments were weak. Farmers watched constantly, judging by color and movement when to act. Cocoons were gathered gently, often with bamboo sticks. They were then boiled or steamed, killing worms inside and softening the filaments. To modernize, the process seems cruel, but to farmers it was necessity. Without it, silk could not be reeled into thread. The smell of boiling cocoons filled houses. Women sat with reels, drawing out strands, twisting them together, winding them onto spools. Each cocoon yielded a thread hundreds of meters long, but fragile. Only by twisting several together could a usable strand be made. This work, slow and repetitive, filled days after harvest. Silk as tax. Much of the silk produced never stayed in households. The state demanded bolts of silk as tax, collected alongside grain. For poor families, this obligation was heavy. Weeks of labor might vanish into the hands of officials. Yet silk was also opportunity. Families who produced surplus could sell it in markets, trading thread for salt, oil, or tools. Skilled weavers could gain local renown, their work carried to cities far away. For women, whose labor often remained invisible, silk offered visibility and value. Bedrooms as workshops. It is worth pausing to imagine the strangeness of those bedrooms. In most homes, a bedroom is private, restful. In these households, it became a workshop, filled with the smell of mulberry leaves and the sound of chewing worms. Families lived, ate, and slept beside their livestock of silk. This intimacy blurred the boundary between human and insect. Farmers adjusted their lives to the worm's needs. Quiet voices, careful movements, constant attention. In a sense, the worms became part of the family, though destined for death at harvest. The empire's dependence. Behind the quiet labor of these bedrooms stood the empire's dependence. The Han dynasty and later rulers relied on silk for diplomacy. Gifts of silk-bound alliances paid troops and impressed foreign courts. A single bolt of silk in Rome could cost the price of gold. Yet in the villages where silk began, it was the product of ordinary women feeding worms with mulberry leaves, their children asleep beside them. The glitter of imperial diplomacy rested on the monotony of domestic care. Reflection. Here you see the paradox of silk. Its beauty dazzled emperors and merchants, but its origin was boring, repetitive, and fragile. It was not born in palaces but in bedrooms filled with worms. And you must ask, did the women who tended silkworms know the reach of their work? Did they imagine their thread crossing deserts, reaching Persia or Rome? Or did they think only of the next feeding, the next tray, the next cocoon? You have seen how worms lived beside families, how women labored to feed them, and how their cocoons became thread for empire. Now you must consider what silk meant for society, how it shaped daily life, and why the legacy of this boring, repetitive labor stretched far beyond the bedroom walls. Silk as currency. In early China, silk was more than cloth. It was money. Soldiers could be paid in bolts of silk. Officials collected silk as tax. Merchants traded silk as readily as coins. In some regions, silk was preferred over bronze because it was lighter to carry and easier to divide. Imagine a farmer delivering not coin but cloth to fulfill obligations. The bolt he carried represented nights of tending worms, days of spinning thread, and weeks of weaving. Silk was not abstract currency. It was labor woven into fabric, visible in every strand. This made the bedroom, with its trays of worms, part of the empire's treasury. Every leaf eaten, every cocoon spun, added to the flow of wealth. Silk as diplomacy. Silk also traveled far beyond villages. Emperors used it as diplomacy, gifting bolts to Central Asian rulers, Indian kings, and Roman merchants. To outsiders, silk seemed miraculous, smooth, shining, unlike anything else. To Chinese rulers, it was a tool of influence. When envoys carried silk along mountain passes, they carried the work of countless households. Villages that never saw Rome still shaped its fashions. Bedrooms filled with worms altered the balance of power between empires. The social weight of sericulture. Within China, sericulture carried social meaning. Women who mastered it gained status. Local communities judged households by the quality of their silk. Officials praised villages with high output. Texts described the Silk Princess legends, tales of women who spread sericulture to new regions. Empresses symbolized their role by leading rituals. Ordinary women mirrored them in daily work, embodying the connection between domestic care and imperial wealth. Men plowed and sewed, but women's work in silk was just as vital. Without it, the empire would lack both luxury and leverage, risks and fragility. Yet silk remained fragile. A disease could wipe out worms. A cold snap could ruin leaves. A mistake in timing could spoil cocoons. Families lived under constant risk of losing a season's labor. This fragility gave sericulture a nervous rhythm. Every day mattered. Worms could not wait for delays. Leaves had to be fresh. Timing of harvest was precise. The entire cycle demanded vigilance, binding households to the discipline of nature. Technology and tools. Over centuries, farmers improved their methods. They built bamboo trays, wooden frames, and tools for reeling silk. Some households constructed separate rooms for worms, but many continued to use bedrooms. The intimacy of human and insect remained, even as technology advanced. The reel, a simple wooden device, turned cocoons into thread. Women spun tirelessly, twisting strands together, winding them onto spools. The hum of reels joined the rustle of worms, creating the soundtrack of sericulture. The broader economy. Silk production did more than sustain households. It fueled trade networks. Merchants carried silk bolts to markets in Chang'an. Traders bought them and sent them westward along the Silk Road. Taxes in silk funded armies and officials. Even temples received offerings of silk, draped on statues or used for rituals. Thus, the bedroom became the root of a global system. Without worms chewing leaves in small houses, there would be no silk markets in Persia, no silk tunics in Rome, no legends of exotic cloth in distant lands. Cultural memory. Despite its importance, The labor of sericulture often faded from cultural memory. Chronicles praised emperors who expanded trade, generals who wore silk banners, and merchants who grew rich. The women who fed worms in bedrooms remained nameless. Their contribution was essential yet invisible, woven into the fabric itself but erased from the stories. Legends remembered a mythical empress who first discovered silk, watching a cocoon unravel in hot tea. But behind the myth stood centuries of anonymous women repeating the same tasks. Cutting leaves, feeding worms, reeling thread. Reflection. What does this tell you about history? That the glamorous surface, the shimmering robe, the diplomatic gift, the costly trade good hides behind it layers of boring, repetitive labor. Silk dazzled courts, but its foundation was worms eating in silence. And here lies the question. When you admire the beauty of silk, do you remember the households that lived with worms in their bedrooms? The families who sacrificed sleep and comfort so the empire could shine?